everybody. Welcome to the history lecture. Today, we're going to talk about the presidency of James Madison. The Madison family was a slave and land-owning Virginia family, prominent in Orange County society. James Madison Jr. was born to James Sr. and Elizabeth Madison on March 16, 1751. In Madison's earliest years, he lived in a smaller house, but at the age of 9, he moved to the Multiplier estate. As a young boy, while studying under his mother, even though he was quite sickly, he had a very studious mind, and he was then, at age 9, sent to the boarding school of a Scottish immigrant named Donald Robertson. While there, he excelled at geography, mathematics, and languages, specifically Latin. After this period, he was tutored by the Reverend Thomas Martin. He convinced James Madison's parents to send him to the University of New Jersey, now Princeton, instead of where most people in Virginia went, William and Mary. While at the university, he studied under the university's president, John Witherspoon. Though John Witherspoon disagreed with David Hume, he often assigned his literature and had Madison read it. This gave Madison two ideas. One, it gave him an open mind. Two, it gave him Humanian views. In 1771, he graduated, but he stayed at the university until a year later, until he left Virginia. For Virginia. While in Virginia, he began to contemplate religion because he felt like he was going to die very soon and very young. During his contemplation, he began to feel disgusted by the prosecution of Virginia Baptists and advocated for full religious freedom. Then, in 1774, when the British very harshly punished Boston after the Boston Tea Party, Madison began to take a role in politics. In 1774, he served on the Safety Commission, and in 1776, he was elected to the Virginia legislature. While in the Virginia legislature, he was mostly quiet because he was surrounded by more experienced and veteran politicians. Until George Mason's Declaration of Rights were put to discussion and the topic of freedom of religion was put. There, Madison advocated strongly for full religious freedom. While being in the legislature, he made a friendship that would last his entire life to a young Thomas Jefferson. In 1777, he lost re-election to the Virginia legislature, but the good thing was he was put on the governor's commission, serving under both Patrick Henry and Thomas Jefferson. While on the council, he saw an incompetent, weak Congress try to manage a war. This gave him two ideas. One, you needed a strong central government that was balanced with personal liberties. After this, in 1780, he became the youngest delegate to the Continental Congress. Then he returned to the Virginia House of Delegates, Virginia Legislative House, where he voted against a bill supporting only Christian teachers. During the Constitutional Convention, he took notes that have been very important to historians. At the convention, he helped draft the Virginia Plan. If you want to learn more, watch my video on the Constitutional Convention. After the convention, he was heavily in favor of ratification and wrote the Federalist Papers with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay. The Federalist paper I would like to look at specifically is Federalist number 39, The Conformity of the Plan to Republican Principles. To begin his essay, James Madison questions, is there any example of a republic in the world? He turns to two examples at first. First, Poland. But then he says, well, it's not really a republic because there's just a few nobles holding power. He then turns to England, but says that that can't be a republic because the only branch of government that is republican is the parliament. So he then defines a government, a republican government, which he says has never been seen before. He defines it as a government that derives its power directly from the people, and that those elected serve a specific tenure or during a time of good behavior where they can be impeached. So then tie it back to the Constitution. He says that these rules apply to the document that would create their government. The House of Representatives are elected to a term that's a set number of years by the people. The Senate, which was elected by the state legislatures instead of directly from the people until the 17th Amendment, is indirectly voted for by the people because they vote for the representatives that vote for the senators. The president, he says, is also indirectly voted from the people by their states. As well as this, all of these elected officials are put up for re-election depending on the length of their term. The judiciary, he points to, however, is not elected, but that's true in many states, and they can be impeached. He then addresses the complaint that many people say that the federal government should be federal. It should only be a confederacy of states instead of a national act. So James Madison then questions, is this really a national government or is it a federal government? To really address this, he asks 3 questions. First, what is the character of the new government? The ratification of the Constitution, he says, will be a federal act because the states themselves have to ratify it. And when it is ratified, the states are still respected as individual bodies. The second question he addresses is, where does the federal government derive its abilities? In the direct election of the members of the House of Representatives, he says, yes, it derives itself from a national place. But in the indirect election of the senators and the president, it's federal because the states vote for their senators and they vote for the president. So, the government derives its powers from a mix of federal and national places. That is what he concludes. The third question is the amending of the Constitution a federal or national act? Well, he says it's a mix for 2 reasons. Well, really 1 reason wrapped into 2 parts. The reason is that it takes less than all of it. You don't need unanimous support to amend it, but you also need more than a majority. So it's not federal because you don't need all, you don't need unanimous, and it's not national because you don't just need that 51%. So because of these papers, which eventually, 85 were written, I believe, the Constitution was ratified. And in February 1789, James Madison won election to the House of Representatives against James Monroe, who was also a close friend of Madison's. In Washington's first term, Madison acted as a close advisor to the president. And his biggest accomplishment during this time was he got the states to ratify the Bill of Rights. Him doing that and writing the Bill of Rights is why he's referred to as the father of the Constitution. Now, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison strongly opposed Hamilton's financial plan. To learn more about Hamilton's financial plan, watch our video on George Washington's term. But for a quick answer, basically, he would put tariffs on goods, pay for manufacturing, subsidize manufacturing to build more manufactories. And because of this, they felt that this was making the government far too strong because they were assuming the national debt of everywhere else. They were paying for things, and this was at the expense of Southern agriculture, which Madison and Jefferson said was the biggest form of the American economy, what the American economy was built on and what it should be built on. But eventually, a compromise was settled by a dinner that Thomas Jefferson held, that they came to a compromise. Alexander Hamilton got his financial plan, but he had to give up the capital. The capital was moved south on the border between Maryland and Virginia along the Potomac River. And in 1793, Madison sided with Jefferson again on the French Revolutionary Wars. Jefferson said, and Madison, that America should get involved in the war because France helped us when we needed it, and we said we'd pay back the favor. Alexander Hamilton, however, did not believe they should help France, but should pursue closer ties with Britain because Britain was their main trading partner. Neither of the two happened because George Washington declared neutrality. Again, video on George Washington. The two-party system were beginning to form over these two issues. And the Jay Treaty only added to the division. If you want to learn more about the Jay Treaty, again, watch my video on George Washington. But basically, it sought to solve some of the issues that had been happening with Britain. Trade, them raiding trade and pressing the sailors. It didn't really solve this issue. But they did get the English to agree to leave their forts in the Northwest Territories. So it was kind of a mixed treaty. Because the Republicans, now called Democratic Republicans, sided with France, they said this document brought America back into the folds of the British Empire. James Madison no longer helped Washington over this issue. And after Madison and the Federalists regained power, he was no longer in the House of Representatives. But not was all bleak. James Madison married his wife Dolly in 1794, who was introduced to him by Aaron Burr, who would go on to shoot Hamilton. When Adams passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, Madison was not in favor of this at all. And when he was reelected to the Virginia legislature, he passed the resolutions of 1800 that attacked the Alien Sedition Acts for being unconstitutional. If you want to learn more about the Alien and Sedition Acts, my video on John Adams. But basically, these were acts that made it harder for immigrants, to get their citizenship, and it said that nobody could print things that were scandalous, untrue, and false about the federal government. In 1800, the Democratic Republicans regained power, and James Madison was made Thomas Jefferson's Secretary of State. This period was called the Revolution of 1800 because the military was partially defunded, judicial appointments were scaled back, and taxes were cut. To learn more about Thomas Jefferson's presidency, my video on it. During Madison's time as Secretary of State, the Louisiana Purchase was made. He sent James Monroe and Robert Livingston to negotiate the treaty with the Marquis de Talleyrand in France. But the more pressing issue at the time was the impressment of American sailors. Impressment was when the English would capture American ships and force the Americans to be in their navy. They did this because they needed manpower to man their massive navy. To try and combat this, both Jefferson and Madison supported the Embargo Act. I talk more about it in my video about Thomas Jefferson, but basically this put a tariff on all imported and exported goods. In the election of 1808, James Madison won a victory against Charles C. Pinckney. And as his first act of the presidency, he renovated the White House using $12,000. Of course, the White House would be burned later on, so waste of money. In foreign affairs, David Erskine, the British ambassador to America, made a deal with the United States Secretary of State Smith to end the Embargo Act. The details were: 1. The British would drop their trade restrictions on America. 2. The United States would agree to stop trading with France. And 3. They would also agree to allow all their shipping to be inspected by the Royal Navy. Madison rejected this proposal, and so did the English Parliament. And during Jefferson's term, tensions with Spain began to heat up over the West Florida territory, where both sides claimed it as their own. So, West Florida declared independence from Spain and sent a letter to Madison to annex them. So, Madison swiftly moved the military into West Florida and annexed them, adding West Florida to America. In the Supreme Court, Fletcher v. Peck was happening. The case arose when Peck was granted land by the state of Georgia. He then sold this land to Fletcher, but he sold it knowing that Georgia revoked the ownership of the land he had. So Fletcher sued him. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled that Georgia had no right to nullify the contract because of Section 1, Article 1, Section 10 of the Constitution, also the Contract Clause. No state shall enter into any treaty, alliance, or confederation, grant letters of marque and reprisal, coin money, emit bills of credit, make anything but gold and silver coin, attender and payments of debt, pass any bill of attainder, ex post facto law, or law impairing the obligation of contracts, or grant any title of nobility. So Georgia could not nullify its contracts. Back in Congress, in May 1810, McConn's Bill No. 2 was passed. This bill said that if either Britain or France dropped their trade restrictions, the president could then only trade with that nation. So basically, let's say France took their restrictions off America. So instead of him trading with both, he could cut off trade to Britain and only trade with France, encouraging Britain to also drop their restrictions. In response to this, Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, sent a letter to the Duke of Cador named the Cador Letter. This said that if the British... Did you move your hand across the screen?
But it was in the shot.
It wasn't? No. Okay. Sorry. Yeah. I'll have to fix this in post. Alright. Don't stop. I'm just going to go 3, 2, 1. Napoleon Bonaparte, the Emperor of France, sent an unofficial letter through the Duke of Cador saying that if the British dropped their restrictions on American shipping coming to France, that France would also drop their restrictions. Quote, "In this new state of things, I am authorized to declare to you, sir, that the decrees of Berlin and Milan are revoked, and after the 1st of November, they shall cease to have effect. It being understood that in consequence of this declaration, the English shall revoke their orders in council and renounce the new principles of blockade which they have wished to establish, or that the United States, conformably to the act you have just communicated, shall cause their rights to be respected by the English." So Madison sent an ultimatum to Britain, saying, "You have 3 months to drop your trade restrictions, or we will only trade with France." Britain was undeterred, and they kept raiding American shipping. And so did France. But America still put the trade sanctions on Britain and only traded with France. And in the cabinet, to keep the Secretary of Treasury Gallatin happy, he dismissed the incompetent Secretary of State Smith in favor of James Monroe. As tensions began to heat up over impressment in trade, war was declared in 1812. This became known as the War of 1812. So, over the next till 1815, when the Treaty of Ghent was signed, the America would try multiple times to invade Canada, only to fail. The White House would be burned, but Baltimore would be saved, inspiring the Star-Spangled Banner. And a young General Andrew Jackson would become famous nationally, and eventually he would be elected as the 7th President of the United States. And I'd like to go into more detail about the war, which I will in one of my future videos. After the War of 1812 ended, Madison then fought the Second Barbary War, where he defeated the Barbary pirates once and for all. Now for my presidential rating. James Madison, I believe I would put at a C. For good things, I guess he finally resolved the issue over impressment, but the war was pretty disastrous, and at one point, the north of the country talked about seceding. So, I knock him points for that, but he defeated the Barbary pirates. Before that, he cut taxes. He seized West Florida. And overall, I put him at C because I think he did about as much harm as he did good to the United States, and I think it balanced out. Alright, thank you all for watching. See you in my next video.